It's April 2015. A man on a rooftop restaurant in Sofia, Bulgaria, slumps in his chair. His heart is slowing. His vision blurring, he sees a kaleidoscope of stars and sparks around him. Within minutes, he's unconscious. This was Emilian Gebrev, a Bulgarian arms manufacturer and dealer. And though it looked like a sudden illness, it was something much more sinister. Someone had just tried to poison him. And over the next few years, I would uncover that this was no ordinary case. It was part of a much bigger operation by an elite Russian sabotage team, Unit 29155. Hi, I'm Christo Grozev, an investigative journalist. This is the second episode in our series about Unit 29155, the Russian GRU's secret sabotage and assassination unit. In our last episode, we covered how the failed poisoning of Sergei Skripal in Salisbury inadvertently put me on the unit's trail and exposed them to the world. But the Skripal poisoning wasn't the first of Unit 29155's missions, and it wasn't their first poisoning on European soil either. Years earlier, there was another poisoning, and it had gone virtually unnoticed, dismissed as potentially a food poisoning or something mundane. But now we had important information about who these operatives were, and it helped uncover a web of other operations they had been involved with. If you haven't watched our first episode on Unit 29155, where we explained the Salisbury poisoning and our subsequent investigation, go back and watch that first. Not only was it the first investigation that gave us clues about who was Unit 29155 and who its members were, but it was also the investigation that made me realize just how crazy Russia was. Before, I never would have believed that they were sending agents across Europe to carry out assassination missions. It was just so unbelievable. As far as I've seen, even the CIA had stopped carrying out these kind of killings in the 21st century, and maybe even earlier, but not Russia, apparently. This led us to start wondering what else the unit had been involved with. Were there other attacks that we had missed? Or ones that were coming? Then, in late 2018, I got a message from a Bulgarian journalist. He told me there had been another suspected poisoning, actually two of them. They had occurred 3 years before Salisbury, in the spring of 2015, in Bulgaria. The target? Emilian Gebrev. Gebrev wasn't a political figure, he wasn't a dissident, he wasn't a spy. He was a businessman, but one who had something that made him a target: weapons contracts. Gebrev is the head of EMCO, one of the only two EU companies that traded modern ammunition compatible with the Soviet-style weapons and artillery back in 2014 and 15. In 2014, he was supplying Ukraine with desperately needed ammunition after Russia invaded Ukraine and Donbass. He was selling arms to Ukraine, something Moscow absolutely did not want. When Gebrev collapsed at dinner in April of 2015, his condition rapidly deteriorated and he actually fell into a coma. But still, the Bulgarian authorities dismissed it as an accidental event. They called it an arugula poisoning. But Gebrev didn't buy it. For years, he fought back the conclusions of the investigators, saying, no, he hates arugula, it was something much worse. And when years later he heard about the Skripal case, something in his mind clicked. The symptoms had been eerily similar, so he pushed to reopen the case. And that's when my Bellingcat team and I decided to dig deeper. The first step was to look at travel records. If this was a Russian operation, the assassins had to have entered Bulgaria somehow. I obtained flight manifests and border control data from data leaks. In those records, I looked for any Russian travelers who had been in Sofia around the time of Gebrev's poisonings. That's when I found a familiar name: Sergei Fedotov. This was the same alias used by the third GRU officer I had discovered in the Skripal case. And here he was, in Bulgaria, just days before Gebrev collapsed. So the same man who poisoned the Skripals, or controlled the poisoning, was also involved in a poisoning in Bulgaria years earlier. It was a shocking connection and made me even more convinced that Gebrev didn't just eat some bad rugula. When we published this connection, Bulgarian investigators reopened Gebrev's case. And when they began to look at Fedotov, they discovered new details. He had stayed at the hotel in Sofia called the Hill Hotel, and he had specifically requested rooms with a view at the parking garage where Gebrev kept his car. And has anyone ever wanted a view to a parking garage? Immediately red flags. When they went back and analyzed the surveillance footage from the hotel during Fedotov's stay, they discovered a shocking scene. In the camera footage, in the garage, a man in a suit approaches the vehicles. But he wasn't breaking in. He wasn't stealing anything. Instead, he leaned down and wiped something on the door handles of 3 cars. That of Gebrev's, that of his son's, and one of his product managers. This was a method we had seen before, with the Skripal case. Truly, it happened 3 years later. A chemical agent, possibly a nerve toxin, applied in a way that would transfer through the skin. Forensic tests in a Finnish lab later confirmed the presence of organophosphates in his bloodstream, a substance similar to Novichok, the poison used in Salisbury. These details finally confirmed that this wasn't food poisoning, it was an assassination attempt. And it didn't just happen once. After Gabriel recovered from his coma and survived the first poisoning in April, he was targeted yet again, just a month and a half later, in late May. Unit 29155 had botched the first attempt, and they were back to try again, this time at his summer home on the Black Sea. Thankfully, he survived that one too, and we were able to connect the same operatives to that attempt as well. How? We saw that they arrived in Varna, about 300 miles up from his summer house. They rented a car a day before the second poisoning, and we got the car mileage report, which is exactly the distance to his summer house and back. That way we finally uncovered the truth of what had happened in Bulgaria. Now we knew that Russian intelligence hadn't just tried to assassinate a former spy in the UK. They had also tried to assassinate an arms dealer on NATO soil 3 years earlier. And we knew that Unit 29155 was behind it. But what else were they behind? How big did this web of deadly operations go? We started pulling the thread. And that's when we connected these same operatives to something else. Something even bigger, a series of devastating arms depot explosions throughout Eastern Europe, targeting warehouses holding arms bound for Ukraine and Georgia, 2 countries that Russia had been at war with. But that's our next episode. Stay tuned, where we uncover how Unit 29155 was behind explosions in these countries. And sign up and subscribe to the Christo Files to stay up to date on this and other investigations.